What's up, YouTube? This is Quan, the Urban Sportsman, again, coming to you guys with another informational video. This one is my tips for um, long line trolling crankbaits, specifically deep crankbaits from the kayak. Um, if you're like me, you fish for pretty much everything. I'm a multi-species fisherman, and whether it's crappie, whether it's bass, or walleye, at some point in time, whether I'm just paddling back from wherever I was initially fishing, I'm always going to be trolling something behind me to see if I can pick up an extra fish or two on the way back to where I docked in at. However, this year, one of the things I started focusing on more was walleye fishing in the spring and summer, and I did pretty well. And what I did initially is I started out by trolling Lindy rigs and crawler harnesses, and I netted quite a few fish that way. However, once we got a little bit further into the summer months and started getting a little warmer, I realized something. I wasn't catching as many walleyes as I wanted to. Yeah, I was catching white perch, white bass that were low in the water column, but I wasn't catching the walleye for some reason. And what I ended up doing is paying closer attention to my electronics to see what the walleye were doing. And what I noticed was those fish were sitting suspended at I say between 8 and 14 feet. And because they were suspended between 8 and 14 feet, everything I was using was passing below. My harnesses, my Lindy rigs were passing below them because they were closer to the bottom. Um, Not only that, but I realized that they were suspended below bait fish. So even if I can get my harnesses up higher, they weren't going after what I was putting in their face anyway. They were chasing bait fish, um, primarily primarily in the earlier summer, younger to year bait fish. So what that caused me to do was to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to start trolling crankbaits to see if I can get more fish. And this is what leads me to my first tip. Tip number one: pick a crankbait that's going to dive down to the depth that you want to catch fish at. If you know your fish are suspended at 8 to 14 feet, you want to pick a bait that's going to dive anywhere between 6 and 12 feet. Mostly because most fish feed upward. So if you know the walleye are feeding up, you want that bait to run directly over the head. So you know they're 8 feet, you want them to run at 6 feet. If they're at 12 feet, you want that bait to run at 11 or 10 feet or even 12 to run right through them so that the fish see it because they feed up. So that's my first tip. Pick something that's going to run at the depth that you want. For me, the walleye were suspending at 8 to 14 feet, anywhere in between there based on where bait fish were. So what I did was I went to flicker shad and the flicker minnow, jointed shad wrap, and also the storm thunder sticks. Um, did that work? Yes, it did help me net a few more fish in the boat than what I had been doing because previously, once they switched over to minnows as bait, wasn't catching anything. Uh, but that made me kind of dissect it more. See, what I do is I troll with two rods parallel in front of me. So one's out on the left, one's out on the right, and I can see when the fish hits. Uh, in doing that, I noticed that because I was trolling a small flicker shad or this jointed shad wrap on one side, the other side I started with 3 or 4 inch bait like this storm thunder stick, and I noticed that the bigger bait wouldn't get hit, and that was because when I initially started trolling with these cranks, it was earlier in the summer, and the bait that they were keying on were smaller bait fish. They were younger than year fish, so they were keying on fish that were inch, maybe inch and a half, 2 inches, and as a result, this guy got me nothing. And that's what leads me into tip two. Match the hatch, man. If you are going to be trolling crankbaits, deep cranks, any cranks, um, match the hatch. Match the size of what those fish are keying on because that's what they're focused on at that time. A lot of times fish, any fish for that matter, but walleye in particular can be finicky, and they can just be like, look, I just don't want that big old thunder stick, even though it's going fast, going by me right, nice and slow, and it's an easy meal. It's odd seeing this 4 inch bait coming through this school of 1.5 inch bait. It just doesn't make sense to them, I guess. And as a result, you just don't catch the same amount of fish. So match the hatch, specifically the size. The color I didn't worry so much about because I matched my colors based on the depth of field in the water. So if the water is real dark or real murky, I matched my colors based on that rather than what the bait fish look like. If it was clear water, then I use a bait fish imitation. But if it's murky, I was going with something brighter or very, very dark. Um, So that's tip number 2, match the hatch. Tip number three for long line trolling crankbaits behind the kayak is to use the right line weight or line diameter for your baits to get down to their maximum diving depth. Uh, One thing I did not think about, which is kind of common sense if you ever read anything about crankbaits, um, the diameter of the line makes a difference in how deep your baits are going to dive. Most time when you see on the back of a bait, I don't have a package here. When you see on the back of a package, it'll say diving depth 8 to 14 feet. Well, that 8 to 14 feet is based on them doing trial runs with 10-pound test line, specifically 10-pound monofilament. And in some cases now they'll have the braid equivalent as well, what size braid they used and how deep it ran with that. The thing that made me realize I was being stupid and not thinking about that is, once again, I said I run 2 rods parallel in front of me. My rod that had the thunder stick on it had heavier line. So the thunder stick still wasn't running down as deep as I needed to run because it had that heavier diameter line. It was 14-pound test. Whereas the Shad Rap and the Flicker Shad had 10-pound tests. They were running right smooth where they were supposed to go. So I was getting more fish that way because my baits were getting down into where the fish were. So that's tip number 4. That's tip number 3. Always make sure you're matching the line weight. And if you're curious or confused as to what test pound line you should be using specifically with the crankbait that you have, you can just go straight to any website, any of the company's websites like Rapala or Storm, and they actually have a diagram that shows you how deep these cranks will run with the different line weights and different line diameters based on whether or not it's fluorocarbon line you're using, monofilament line, or braid. For me, I run mono with crankbaits because I want that stretch. That's just me. That's my personal opinion. I want that stretch so I'm not losing as many fish. That brings me to tip number 4. This was another thing that made me think about whether or not my baits were getting as deep as I wanted them to get. And it is this. Tip number 4 for long line and deep cranks behind a kayak is you want to know how far you have to have that bait behind you in order for it to run through the depth. In other words, how much line you have out matters. If you look at the charts on the different websites, they usually say 100 feet, 200 feet behind you. This is the depth that this bait is going to run. So let's use the Flicker Shad, for example, or Flicker Minnow, for example. If it's 200 feet behind me, it's going to run to 14 feet. If it's only 100 feet, it's only going to run to 8 feet. That's just me running out the back of my head. I could be totally wrong on numbers, but this is just an example of what I'm saying. So what you want to keep in mind is you might cast out. And when you cast out, you might only cast 60 feet. Don't expect your crankbait to run to the depth that you need it to run to if it doesn't have the proper amount of line out in order for it to get down. What I would do, and this is just me specifically with the lighter baits like this guy, there's no way I was getting a 200 foot cast with this little jointed Shad Rap or the Flicker Shad. No way. So what I would do is I would cast out to the side and then I would start paddling. And as I paddle, I'm marking how much line is going out. And right when I think I'm at 150, 200 feet, boom, I go ahead and lock my bill back, set my rod in the rod holder, and I'm good to go. And I'm trolling from there. So that's tip number 4. Make sure you have enough line out to get those baits down to the proper depth so you can get the fish and keep that bait in the strike zone. Tip number 5. This is something I had to learn the hard way. I lost a pretty big walleye doing this. Do not troll 2 floating crankbaits at the same time. The reason why is because fish don't do what you want them to do. Consider this. You got 2 lines out, and in some cases, some people might be running 3. Let's say you're running 2 lines, and they're both 200 feet behind you. When you stop paddling to catch this fish that just bit the rod on the left, that other floating crankbait floats to the top. So now you have all this line that's out behind you. And what if the fish decides, well, I want to go to the right. I don't want to run to the left or behind you or wherever. I want to run to the right. So now it's spinning you and your kayak around. and as it spins you around, it's gonna spin right into that other line and tangle you up. I've had that happen multiple times with walleye, and it ticked me off because I'm like, man, there has to be a better way for me to not keep having to fish through this other line just to get my fish. And what I learned was I'll never run two cranks at the same rate like that again. Never especially two deep running cranks. Nothing that has to have a lot of line I'll be having. So what I'll do is one side I'll have a deep crank, and the other side I'll run a three-way rig. And I'll run that three-way rig with a live bait rig like a crawler harness or Lindy rig or a floating jig head and minnow, or I'll run a shallow running crank on a three-way rig because that shallow running crank is going to stay right down where I want it to be. However, if you're going to do that shallow running crank or spoons, make sure you don't have so much line out, specifically with spoons, so much line out that when you stop, the spoon goes down to the bottom. If it goes down to the bottom, it's going to get you snagged up. That's just a hassle. When I ran shallow running cranks, specifically behind a three-way rig, I always either run floating cranks or I run suspending crankbaits. That way, when I stop, that crank, instead of going down to the bottom and potentially get snagged, it's going to float up or it's going to suspend right where it is. That particular tip actually leads into my last tip, which is number 6. When you're running deep cranks in particular, or any crank for that matter, and you're trolling cranks behind a kayak, one of the things you have to consider is that you're going to stop paddling or pedaling at some point. And when you stop paddling or pedaling, that crankbait's going to float to the top. So what I found was this tip is what helped me. Tip number 6. Make sure you find a way to help that crankbait either slow its ascent or attain neutral buoyancy. So what I mean by neutral buoyancy is where it becomes a crankbait that suspends. For me, I did 2 things. 1, I use lead tape. So I put a very small strip of lead tape right here. Right? Let's see if I can find it. This is kind of small, so it's going to be kind of hard to show you. So a very small piece of lead tape right here. And what you do is you put it in a bucket, push it down to the middle of the bucket full of water, and see how fast it ascends. And if it slows it down, then you're doing what you need to do. Another thing I do, which I haven't done with this bait or the Shad Rap, which I plan on doing, is I change to heavier hooks. It doesn't make much of a difference, but it's enough of a difference to kind of slow the ascent. Beware with lead tape. You still want to test the way to see that your bait swims true afterwards, because too much lead tape will affect the action of your lure. So I only use a little bit. So at worst, I might not get neutral buoyancy. It may not suspend, but I know it's going to slow down that ascent. And for me, I know I've caught at least a couple of white bass and one walleye that way. Is where I stopped, I'm reeling in one fish, and all of a sudden I look over and my left rod is dancing, and I'm like, well, okay, cool. That's perfect for me. I don't have to do anything. I got a fish waiting for me. So in that instance, what I would do is set my right rod back into the rod holder, paddle real fast so I can set the hook on the other fish and go ahead and finish fighting the fish that I was initially fighting, and go ahead and get it on board and then go on and fight the second fish. Pretty simple tips. I'll go over them real quick. First tip, just to rehash it. First tip, pick the crankbait that you need to dive directly to the depth you want. The second tip, match the hatch, specifically the size of the bait that the fish are keying on. The third one, use the right line weight and diameter to get your baits down to the depth that you want them to get to. Fourth tip, how much line you have out affects how deep the crankbait will dive. The fifth tip, do not troll 2 deep diving crankbaits behind you parallel. The last one, which is number 6, use lead tape to help your baits achieve neutral buoyancy, or to at the very least slow their ascent. Those are my tips personally for when I troll for pretty much any species, be it white bass, walleye, crappie, anything. Those are my tips for trolling behind the kayak. If you have some tips that I missed, please post them below. Feel free to comment, like, and subscribe. I really appreciate everything you guys have done for us, people subscribing and commenting. Beyond that, it's the winter time. The ice is starting to get not necessarily thick, but it's starting to show up. And if you have thick enough ice out in your area, please, please make sure you take a kid fishing. And hey, feel free to post those pictures out on Facebook so we all can see them and share in your joy. Have a good day. Thanks again, and tight lines, people.